It's Black History Month, and we are joining in by celebrating African American cultural expressions in Chicago. It is my pleasure to welcome Sterling D. Plumpp, Professor Emeritus of African American Studies, Literature, and Creative Writing, winner of 2 Illinois Arts Council Awards for Poetry, the Carl Sandburg Literary Award for Poetry, and the American Book Award for Home Base. First and foremost, Sterling is a poet par excellence, a wonderful human being. We could easily describe as encyclopedic in his vast knowledge, in full harmony with ancestral wisdom, combined with sparkling intellectual curiosity. Welcome, Sterling, and thank you for accepting my invitation to talk together about poetry, music, and African American realities in the United States, past and present.
Here I go, walking along the street again.
You wrote in Home Base, "When I visit huge mansions, I run around to the back, looking for the house, behind the big house, where my origins begin in this republic." Born on a cotton plantation in Clinton, Mississippi, 82 years ago, you were not cuddled into a cradle with the destiny to become a university professor. You faced then a very different reality.
Well, yes, my grandparent who reared me until I was 15 were born in 1880 and 1890 respectively. I was literally born 5 miles where they had served servitude as sharecroppers, and their parents had been slaves. I was born into their culture.
Mm-hmm.
I was in some ways fortunate in that I was born in a situation where my father was not the husband of my mother, and at birth, my mother cared for me a little while, but my grandmother cared for me so much in the early years until I don't even remember my mother as my mother. So, their language, their Weltanschauung about what it meant to grow with the new century, with slavery on their backs, servitude on their backs. I grew to that. And that's what I was destined to do.
Mm-hmm.
I was destined to become a sharecropper, perhaps an Emmett Till, be killed. I mean, that's part of the biography of males in the South. You work until you die, you say something inappropriate, and you are executed. It was a world white individuals are as close to you as characters in novels. There is no human experience. I mean, I lived on one plantation the first 9 years of my life. Can remember about 3 times where the owner of the plantation came out. And all I can remember about him is he had a hat on, he was white, and he had authority. Don't remember any pictures of him. Mm-hmm. His skin was white. Mm-hmm. He didn't say anything that brilliant. But very early I knew that sometime towards the end of August, when the cotton bolls opened, that my grandfather had to inform him that he would be bringing cotton in to be ginned. That's my earliest memory of that life. When you are not from an educated African-American family, Plessy versus Ferguson, de jure segregation. See, those words don't mean anything to you. You know, you're told to mind how you act, and particularly speak to white people. I mean, that's what you're told. That somehow subservient gestures, whether verbal or non-verbal, would ensure your survival.
Mm-hmm. You were supposed to fit in perfectly to correspond to the image and to the role which was assigned to you.
Yeah. Particularly as you grow older, you see there are 2 existences. When you begin to work, is when you come into contact with whites. Mm-hmm. See, the child, they don't come into your home, so when you're a child, you're relatively free. But if you work or you go to the store, you
yes.
meet them.
As a matter of fact, it did take some time until you could attend school, no?
Yeah, my grandmother originally, I thought that she was ignorant of PRJ and Erickson, and didn't see the need to send me to school at age 6. But my aunt told me that in my grandmother's conception of the world, that it was a 3-mile trip by foot to and from school. And my grandmother felt that if she lose one of her children, she didn't know what she would do. And so she decided to wait until I was big enough to, quote unquote, take care of myself before she sent me to school. And so I was born in January of 1940, did not go to school until October of 1948, the first time. So that left me 2 years behind many students.
Well, I mean, a 3-mile walk for a small kid. You were tall and you were strong, but still 3 miles walking, that's not a little distance. But then you had an opportunity to attend Catholic school at a certain point.
Yes, in many ways, the worst fear I had growing up as a child was that my grandparent would die before I became an adult. And January 8, 1955, my grandfather died. At the time, my brother and first cousin was living with my grandfather, so we moved from the Plantation to Jackson, the city.
Jackson, Mississippi.
And there's another factor. My grandmother could not take care of or deal with 3 adolescent boys. And so after about a year, we were permanently segregated. For a while I lived with my mother. But one of the issues was I was in the 7th grade, 14, about to turn 15 years old. And the decision was, do I continue my education? My cousin and my brother quit. And what it meant, it was, I was from the rural area, out of place, but the Catholic school, a little history, the first accredited public high schools for blacks in Mississippi was the high school I went to, Holy Ghost High School, developed by the Divine Word missionaries. There's some history that needs to be told. Ordinary seminaries would not accept blacks. And somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, a group of German came to Mississippi and established a seminary to train African Americans in the priesthood. They also had a group of nuns. Now, the Catholic Church is a peculiar institution. It was not their intent to provide education to those in the cotton fields. Their intent was to educate the most literate upper class African Americans, owners of funeral homes, dentists, doctors, sons and daughters of college professors, and school teachers. And so when I left the feudal school system of the cotton plantation, I found myself thrust immediately among the upper classes of the black community literacy, and literally in the class with 2 students who on separate occasions became Supreme Court justices from the state of Mississippi. They were actually in that class when I went there. So it was there, and you have a dual problem. You don't quite fit into that environment if you're 15 in the 7th grade from a social aspect. So my social life. The other aspect is I had come from a situation where I never went to school a full year. You know, I went to school in October, quit in May, sometime April, and was not really sure how I would acquit myself on the meritocracy scale of these African Americans who had come from literary background. That was my great fear.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the one gift, I don't know, the one gift that I almost had naturally is I had a near photographic memory for anything that I heard. You know, so if it's an algebra problem and you say quadratic equation, I could almost graft it. I mean, that stayed, that did not leave. Mm. That allowed me, I suppose in the 7th and 8th grade, there's another factor that enters in. There is pigmentation problem. If you're African American, very dark, nobody expects you to do anything. And I was in a school where my classmate had green eyes, mm-hmm. blue eyes, gray eyes, because of the racial climates that evolved from slavery. And you sense afterwards that if you were light, had quote unquote hair that was not nappy, people expected you to be smart. You were dark, and there's a difference. The plantation life had a plantation language system. Mm-hmm. The first people I knew who spoke standard English were school teachers and their children. And I did not have everyday correspondence with them. That's how the South is a kind of class situation, but somehow the 7th and 8th grade maybe B minus to B. But for some reason, you mature and maybe you had a teacher. High school was straight A.
You told me once that you have always been tall. You have always been strong.
Yeah.
And you were a young man who could go into a fight, but you decided that your weapon, that your defense, that your strength shall be knowledge.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing. I have 3 brothers, one on my mother and 2 on my father. And in fact, I was tall. But I don't want to say this. With males, with athletics, there are 2 ways that you could fight. One way is to be strong. Another way is to be quick. Mm-hmm. And when I was on the plantation, if someone did something to me, my brothers would beat them to within an inch of their life. No, they would defend me. Mm-hmm. When I went to move to Jackson, the one thing I discovered about, and I think it might be universal, if you're smarter than people, it's very hard for them to make fun of you. You know, it's very difficult.
That's the way you have chosen then.
Walking lonely streets again.
Let's maybe make a jump north.
Yes.
You wrote that's just a little excerpt from a poem in Home Base. Maxwell Street is the last name of dreamers. Maxwell Street is the Mississippi. Vintage dream. You can drink it. This is, of course, part of your homage to the legendary Maxwell Street and its vibrant market. What has attracted you to Chicago when you first traveled north in 1961? Were you a dreamer too?
It's somewhat, how do I want to say it? When I graduated from high school at the age of 20 in 1960, Jackson State University had offered me a full scholarship, everything.
Mm-hmm.
There was another college in Atchison, Kansas, St. Benedict's, run by the Benedictine monks, offered me maybe tuition. They free tuition, but I had to pay room and board. And what happened, I left Mississippi, went to St. Benedict's College. I had relatives in Chicago who were factory workers, and I would come there during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
After 1 year at St. Benedict's, it was apparent that it would be impossible for me to stay on campus and continue my education that way. My aunt could not supplement it.
Yes.
The job would not pay enough money for me to pay for books and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to take a job at the Chicago Post Office.
Mm-hmm.
But Maxwell Street comes in, my relatives worked in brush factories, education was third to about sixth grade. And they would go, they didn't say Maxwell Street, they would go to quote unquote Jewtown to get what they needed, whether it's clothing or what, they would go down.
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. The other aspect of Maxwell Street, I lived Lawndale, the place in Chicago where the post-World War II migrants, black migrants came. And literally 3 blocks from me, I could go see Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and those people, and decided, one day that I was going down to Maxwell Street, and there would be several places where they would play, and people would come by and throw coins into a box or a guitar. Some of the same people that you saw playing would do that. Later on, I had learned somewhere around the age of 20, maybe James Baldwin, the great novelist, and Ralph Ellison, the great novelist. What Baldwin says, it is only in his music that the Negro has been able to tell his story.
On the occasion of a joint interview with Amiri Baraka back in 1982, you said, I was more of an activist in the 60s than I was a poet, marching and demonstrating and other things, but they actually believe that the poetry could be made more national in terms of black culture if music and speech were incorporated creatively. Would you say that also politics were an important part at the origin of your poetry?
Yeah, well, yes, I mean, racism is a word that doesn't mean anything. Well, let me put it this way. In the South, well, you had the legacy of slavery, Plessy versus Ferguson, and you had state laws and behaviors that quote unquote kept African Americans in their place. See, that's one. That's one kind of experience. Chicago it's not Chicago, but when you're dealing with the Industrial Revolution and you create this category of worker, you know, you don't have segregation on no assembly line. I mean, you're dealing. I mean, it takes a while to understand it. But the reality of it is, if your skin is like mine, you go to a neighborhood and you look around, everybody's skin is the color of mine. No law. Now, that's one. I had come from a community and a history where African Americans went to black colleges. And if you are in higher education, you want to be an engineer, maybe get a PhD degree. It's not commonly known, but the state of Mississippi would subsidize, pay for your tuition if you wanted to be an engineer and you went to Purdue, University of Illinois at Urbana, rather than Ole Miss. You know, what you find, what I found, don't know anything about racism, but Chicago was heavily ethnic. By the 1960s, it was clear to me that the education system was not working for African Americans, and that African Americans, almost like Native Americans, had a restricted area or reservation where they lived, and I thought that you had to march against that. I mean, I was completely against. I can remember marching in South Shore, Rainbow Beach. African Americans could not live, and so I would march. Then again, the man's name was Benjamin Willis. He was the superintendent of schools, and rather than building classroom for African American children, he proposed that you would have some trunks temporarily. You know, I was against that. I marched to Cicero, Illinois, because there was an incident where a young black, for some reason, after dark, was in Cicero, Illinois, and a group of terrorists beat him to death. I thought that you had to do that. I was someone who were very much engaged in boycott and nonviolent resistance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when it comes to violence, you know, I don't know what violence is. Right? You know, I don't know what violence is. Having read and been influenced by Western history, the one thing that stuck in my mind, and I don't know Marx's ideology. All I know is that somehow maybe Lenin, Stalin, and the Bolshevik Party, you know, they set up this worker state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the process, maybe the emperor lost his head. You know, I mean, yeah, you know, so you know, but violence was not one of the things that came in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that you know, I knew enough about history, about Rome. You know, there were a lot of heroic people stood up against the Roman enemy, and they died. They killed you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People in power killed you if you lose. See, there's no other recourse. Lose an insurrection,
Yes.
you die. You know, and that's when I began to think about how did the ex-slaves accommodate themselves and develop a culture. Because I kind of feel that the first language the slaves spoke, I think it was Negro spirituals. In my mind, see, my mind stays there, and maybe the next language they spoke was something like blues. Leroy Jones wrote a book called Blues People.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening by the time 1900, 1925, you're looking at a situation where you have a significant number of African Americans who are urbanized, literate enough to understand European musical structures and instruments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those are, now and this is very complex. It's not complex, but it's complex in one sense. The African American picking up a trumpet not only understands European chordal structure, right, but he has an entire folk history of music. And so, and I thought, you know, I don't, you know, when I listen to jazz, it's the improvisational side of the music. When I hear that's an artist African American, that is not from a composer, and a simple reason. You know, African Americans, nobody knows the trouble I see. Well, where's the script? So you improvise. If all of this is in your head, you know, and I like to go back maybe 2000, before the Bible was written down, and see how these Hebrew people sang it. And that's what's essentially happening with African American culture. Improvisation is the method.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're not taught anything about the music, and if you come here playing distinctly African music, you face death. And so improvisation became a way for educated African Americans somewhere between 1940 and 1950. The most important development in the music was the deconstruction of the big band. That is, you don't have Count Basie. You have the Dizzy Gillespie quartet.
Yes.
You know, and that does two things for the melodic instrument. The trumpet can improvise far more in a quartet than they can in an orchestra.
In an ensemble.
So that's what's happening. Now, all of this is not. It takes place, I think, in African American space, but all of it's not, because later on you getting, Dave Brubeck and people. African American was not only the first ones to play that music, but if you look at American music, the big band, Louis Armstrong singing, I would suspect that he had more impact on Frank Sinatra, Lena Horne. But then if you jump down 20 years from that and look at bebop, you're talking about Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, because it's improvisational. I mean, the musicians, the bands, there's nothing unusual. You know what? Here's one of the mistakes. Every African American does not possess the knowledge of African American culture. See, I have a problem generationally, because people say, you don't like rap? I said, no, I like Billie Holiday. I like people singing lyrics originally. Well, no, you're not singing it. I mean, if the slaves had wanted to rap Negro spiritual, they would have rapped it. But fortunately for them in the world, they sung it. There's a difference. And you're born into that, and the great man Langston Hughes was the first person to improvise with taking a blues verse and having it stand for a stanza in poetry. He did it maybe in 1926 in a book called The Weary Blues. And maybe 3 or 4 years later, he did another book called Fine Clothes to the Jew. Now, the interesting thing about Hughes is not the descendant of a slave. In 1940, maybe 1920, his father might have been Mexican, part Mexican. All I know that he sent Langston Hughes from Mexico City to Columbia University in New York, where he became the first African American to live on a dormitory, sent him there to be an architect. And Langston Hughes, like any smart black boy, went out to Harlem, heard black people speaking, and he thought that the blues verse authentically represented what their language was doing. Now,
Here I go, walking along the streets again.